que aunque norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al cabo somos latinos. Quiero que la unión que logra la fuerza rompa divisiones y abra más puertas. Quiero que entendamos que cuando todos sumamos se hace la diferencia. Diversos como hay palabras en el diccionario, todos los significados usan el mismo abecedario. Yo soy como tú.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today's event comes at a critical time as Colombia's strategic landscape and geopolitical alliances continue to shift. Less than a month ago, President Petro signed a formal agreement for Colombia to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm Jason Marzek, Vice President, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and coming to you from Washington, D.C. This is more than a symbolic gesture. What Colombia is doing reflects as well Beijing's deepening role in Colombia's economy through infrastructure investment, concessional finance, technology transfer, and project delivery speeds that traditional partners, especially the U.S., have struggled to match. Last year alone, China-Colombia trade reached $21 billion, with China now Colombia's top source of imports. Recent commitments from Beijing include smart grid upgrades, port renovations, and AI pilot zones in Bogota and Medellin. At its surface, the appeal of China's model lies in its bundled approach: infrastructure, technology, and financing delivered as a single package, often with fewer conditions and faster timelines. The U.S., for the moment, is carefully crafting a plan to compete more effectively. Tools like the Development Finance Corporation remain underutilized in Colombia, and President Trump's current push to modernize it is, in fact, a major step in the right direction. But showing up U.S. influence in Colombia will require more than just updated tools. It will also require a strategic rethink of how the U.S. approaches economic statecraft across the region. Today's event aims to answer three questions. First, how do Colombians perceive China's growing presence and influence? As well, which sectors are likely to see the most activity under this new China-Colombia partnership? And what concrete steps can the U.S. and its allies take to offer an attractive alternative, one grounded in transparency, long-term value, and mutual benefit? I'm absolutely thrilled that today's event is co-hosted with Fede de Soroyo and Luis Fernando Mejia. This is one of Colombia's most respected policy institutions, and importantly, along with the Atlantic Council, a founding member of the CEPAS network, which is a regional think tank network launched last month in Chile that focused on strengthening policy coordination across the Americas. Before we dive into our discussion, I'd like to begin by introducing Andrew Rosati, a journalist and analyst with Bloomberg, who will walk us through new public opinion polling on Colombian perceptions of China's presence and influence. This data provides a critical foundation for understanding how recent developments are being perceived by the Colombian public and what that might mean for the country's long-term engagement with both China and the U.S. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us and for using the Atlantic Council platform to present this timely and important research. Following Andrew's presentation, we'll feature a panel of experts who will help us to unpack what the evolving China-Colombia relationship means in practical terms and how the U.S. and its partners can respond effectively. This includes Sandra Borda, a professor and international affairs analyst and one of Colombia's leading voices on foreign policy. She brings deep insight into the geopolitical drivers behind Colombia's engagement with China and the broader implications for our bilateral relationship. Then, of course, Luis Fernando Mejia, Executive Director of Fede de Soroyo, which is, I mentioned, one of the most influential policy institutions in Colombia, and also provides important economic context on the trade and investment dynamics emerging from this new alignment. And then finally, our own senior fellow, Enrique Millan, who leads the center's work on economic development and recently co-authored a policy brief on DFC reform. My colleague, AELAC Senior Fellow Jeff Ramsey, will moderate today's discussion. Jeff leads our work on Colombia and Venezuela. As well, if you have any questions for Andrew, the panelists, please use askac.org or ask.org. Thank you so much for joining us today and look forward to a great conversation. Andrew, over to you.
Great, thanks for having me. So let's get started. For those of you who don't know, LATAM Pulse is a partnership between Bloomberg News and the Brazil-based pollster Atlas Intel. We put out monthly polling on most of Latin America's largest economies. Part of what I do at Bloomberg is diving into the data, looking at regional trends, and shifting popularity of some of the region's key leaders. The poll we're going to look at is our latest data out of Colombia. This is some of the brief methodology. One key thing to note here with this poll, there's a margin of error of plus or minus 2 percentage points. And for those of you who don't know Atlas, they've been gaining prominence for some of their recent polling they did in the last Brazilian elections and also in the US, but they are online pollsters. Everything is done in a methodology that looks at users or respondees while they're browsing. This is very different from a lot of traditional Latin American polling, what tends to be still doing by telephone or face-to-face polling. These polls tend to come out very quickly, and just keep in mind when you are looking and we peruse the data. One thing I wanted to start off as we make clear in this presentation, a little bit of context, is U.S. remains by and large Colombia's main business partner. And this is kind of an exception in the region, South America, where increasingly China is dominating commerce across the region. I mean, there is a lot of growing influence in trade in Colombia, but to this day, the U.S. is by far the biggest partner. And when we look at the data, Colombians are very aware of this. They by nearly 60% of Colombians feel this way in our last polling. And, it does not, this influence the U.S. has did not at this point seem to be in jeopardy. However, some more context, what we are seeing in recent months is President Donald Trump is seen in a very negative light. His popularity among Colombians is sliding very quickly. Currently, over 60% of Colombians or Colombian respondees have a negative view of Donald Trump, and just over 20% of a positive view. And this is not something we're polling every month, but in the last numbers we have from April. And it's an important thing to think about as we move forward with the next questions we're asking. And one last bit of context before we dive into May's numbers. In October, before Donald Trump won the presidency, Colombians were asked which countries should Latin American countries align more closely with. The U.S. dominated this with over 40% of respondees saying that Latin American countries should lean towards or align more closely with the U.S. This is, if you can look at China, only 3.4%. Now, when we go into May's numbers, the question is going to change slightly, but this is a really important baseline to think about as we look into our numbers from last month. And this is something that caught mine and Jeff's attention. So now, last month, a key question we asked Colombians: which countries should Colombia align more closely with? The question changed slightly, but the numbers are still very surprising. The U.S. still leads, but from October, when we asked about the region, who the region should align with, Colombia feels that Colombia, over a third of Colombians now feel that they should align more closly. This blows away the EU, BRICS, and Russia. This is, in my opinion, a huge jump in the course of just a few months. So when I think about this as a journalist, what are the things that could have affected these perceptions? And I wanted to flick at some work from my colleagues, and because a lot has happened in the last few months. We had that very ugly spat between Petro and Donald Trump, lots of angry tweets and ratcheting up of sanctions, visa restrictions. Much of that was ratcheted back down, but it's important to remember we had the rollout of Donald Trump's global tariffs. Worldwide, most countries are receiving at least 10% import tariffs. And perhaps to keep in mind is that while tariffs between the US and China, at one point cleared 100% and have since calmed down, the view is that we're still going to have high tariffs between the two countries for the foreseeable future. So what does this all mean for Colombia? What we're seeing in the numbers is that Colombians are very concerned of the trade war between the US and China. Nearly 60% of Colombians feel that the trade war will affect their economy at least significantly. If you put in looking at the other numbers away, it's by and large a huge chunk of the population that are concerned about this. And when we look at it, and when we start looking at what trade means between Colombia and the US and Colombia and China, another interesting thing that jumped out at me, and we look at these numbers, is that Colombians feel over a third feel that the US is getting a better deal. And that when we start to look at China, this is not the case. But we have this very, increasingly harsh rhetoric from the US, and this seems to be being felt by Colombians in not a positive light. And when we look at China, which country benefits the most in Colombia, China, battlefield, over 40% think they're benefiting equally. And only about 17% think only China is getting a better, only China's benefiting, and just a third think China is getting a better deal. Now, the 1/3%, the 1/3 is comparable to the US, but it really striking to me that Colombians feel that the trade partnership is in some ways fairer for them. And this is, I think, a nice transition to the next thing. Which country offers better investment opportunities to Colombia? Again, China has climbed significantly. We're seeing over a third of Colombians saying that China offers better investment and financing opportunities to Colombia. And when you consider the margin of errors, that's comparable to the US. But when you consider the long-term economic and diplomatic relations between US and Colombia, these numbers are striking. So when we start thinking about these numbers and what could have influenced these perceptions, I wanted to highlight, this is a story we did out of Bloomberg 5 years ago, but I think it rings true today. Even during the presidency of Ivan Duque, we saw China, a staunch US ally, pouring financing infrastructure projects, notably the Bogota Metro, were going into Colombia. This whole time, that was under Trump 1, and now under Trump 2, we're seeing the rhetoric and tensions flare even more. But this financing continues. And when you ask Colombians who they should be doing more business with, again, China surpasses the US significantly. Regional trade among Latin America is the most popular, but the gap between China and the US remains. And how does that compare around the region? Well, it's actually China is gaining traction from Mexico to Argentina. By and large, in Latin America, what we're seeing from the polling is that Latin Americans want more business with China. And the only country we've seen, not available on the screen, that is gaining favor with that prefers more trade with the US is Argentina. But every other major economy is wanting more and more trade with China. And this kind of brings me as what I've been thinking a lot in these last few months as a journalist is, as we see this trade spat with China and the US, we're seeing a division across the region. In my reporting, what I've found is this is very region. It's going to be split between countries closer to the US, whether that's Mexico, Central American countries probably being pulled closer to the US. But by and large, across South America, they're leaning towards China in perceptions and trade, with the deals what we've been seeing in the last few months, whether it's in Brazil or elsewhere in the region. Colombia has long been this outlier there, and I'm not suggesting in this polling that it's certainly going to switch sides overnight. But what these numbers are showing us is that Beijing is clearly starting to win hearts and minds, and this could provide an opportunity for policymakers and business leaders in Beijing, especially given how early we are in this presidency, and at a time where many of the tools the U.S. would use to combat this, whether that's U.S. aid, whether that's the State Department, are being diminished. So it's does not paint. The numbers do not paint a favorable situation for the U.S. competing with Chinese political and business interests at this moment. I think that's about it for me, Jeff. Was there any of the slides you want me to swing back to? We have a minute or two, yes, I'm aware, but
No, that's so great. That's great. Thank you so much, Andrew. I think this is a really useful presentation, and this is exactly why we wanted to start off our conversation today with your help in framing the numbers. I did just want to ask, could you give us some more context on the region? So, you all worked with Latin Pulse to poll attitudes towards China and the U.S., not just in Colombia, but in other countries in the region. Could you just maybe go back to that slide and remind us where Colombia stands vis-a-vis others in the region?
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think. Go ahead.
no, and what does that say about Colombians' attitudes towards China and the U.S. in a regional context?
Look, when I saw these numbers last month with my colleagues at Bloomberg, it really jumped out at us. I mean, especially you look at Mexico, the U.S.'s number one trade partner in the region. I mean, we're seeing huge jumps and an interest of doing more business with China. Colombia sits, as you can see, right in the middle, but across the region, there is being big gains for the idea of doing business with China. As I mentioned before, Argentines, in the numbers, some of these are not available on the screen. They are warmer to doing more business. This is in the context of President Javier Milei wanting or trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the U.S. But especially when you consider Peru, Peru and Chile, the Southern Cone, other parts of South America, huge interest in doing more business. Brazil is split, you'll see there. I mean, I think this is in part just the own divisions in Brazil, political divisions. Important to note that former President Jair Bolsonaro was a staunch ally of Donald Trump and modeled much of his rhetoric and political tactics on him. So that split down the middle there doesn't surprise me as much, but still, I mean, over half the population in every major economy in the region wants to do more business with China.
Hmm. Well, that's certainly some striking figures. Thank you so much, Andy, and to Bloomberg for sharing that with us. And I encourage everyone to take a look at your reporting on this issue. And I want to remind everyone that we want to have a conversation here. So if you have questions for Andrew or our other panelists, please chime in at askac.org. That's askac.org. You can put your questions to our speakers there, and I will read them live on air here. I want to go now to Luis Fernando Mejia, the executive director of Colombia's leading economic think tank, Fe Desarrollo. I should say that Fe Desarrollo is a founding member, along with the Atlantic Council, of the CEPAS Regional Think Tank Network. And we're very pleased to be able to partner with Fe Desarrollo on today's event. Luis Fernando, thanks so much for joining us today. Can I get your thoughts on these polling numbers that Andy's just presented, and the broader implications of Colombia's decision to join BRI?
Okay, thank you, Jeff. First, I would like to thank Jason and all the Atlantic Council team for organizing this conference, as well as the Desarrollo team. This is the first event we're doing in the context of the launch of the CEPAS network, so it's great to be here. Well, very interesting numbers, very insightful presentation by Andrew. And I think that Colombia's recent decision to join the Belt and Road Initiative should be seen above all as a step towards diversifying our sources of financing and expanding our global economic engagement, which I think is the right policy. We can discuss whether it was the right timing, but I do think that it goes in the right direction. In that sense, the medium and long-term macro implications, I think, could be largely positive if we approach this opportunity in a strategic way. So Colombia has traditionally depended on a narrow set of bilateral relationships and multilateral lenders for infrastructure financing. In this context, joining the BRI opens the door to a broader range of capital sources, and that increased optionality can improve our negotiating leverage, reducing financing costs, and filling critical infrastructure gaps. So I think that's important. So we're not talking about an immediate avalanche of Chinese investment. I think it's rather a formalization of a channel that could, over time, support much needed development in sectors like transportation, energy, and digital connectivity. So when managed well and if embedded within a comprehensive development plan, this kind of external capital can boost productivity, create jobs, and help modernize Colombia's infrastructure base, which are key drivers of long-term economic growth. There's a question about, of course, debt sustainability, but I would caution against overly alarmist narratives in that front. Colombia has, I think, very robust institutions and relatively sound fiscal management, although the fiscal space is a little bit tight currently, especially compared with other countries that have run into trouble with BRI linked loans. So the core issue, I think, is not the source of financing, but rather how that financing is used. The real risk lies in channeling resources toward unproductive or politically driven projects rather than investments that generate long-term economic returns. So that's ultimately a matter of domestic governance, not, I think, an inherent flaw in Chinese financing itself. So in sum, I think joining the BRI does not mean abandoning our principles or becoming overly dependent on China. I think it means adding a new instrument to the toolkit, and now the focus should be on setting the right rules and priorities to ensure that any engagement, Chinese or otherwise, serves the national interest.
Thank you so much, Luis Fernando. I want to circle back to that, particularly on the way in which Colombia can balance its relationship with China as well as with the United States. But first, I want to bring in Sandra Borda. Sandra is an associate professor at Los Andes University and an expert on Colombian politics and international relations. Sandra, from a political and a social standpoint, how is this being perceived in Colombia? What is your reaction to some of the polling numbers we've just heard, and what are your thoughts on Petro's recent decision to join the BRI and what it means for Colombia in the current context?
Hi, Jeff. I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble with the internet connection, but thank you so much. Thank you, the Atlantic Council and Fedesarrollo for the invitation. I have to say that I'm very surprised by this data that we're seeing today, because this is something very different from what we have seen so far in terms of the polls of international relations perceptions that people have here in the country. It used to be a very a clear landscape, right? I mean, we used to have a very favorable public opinion vis-a-vis the US. And I remember the times, and this is probably the last time that they did the old polls was I would say, I want to guess that it was probably 7, 10 years ago. And it was very clear for public opinion that, for us, having had a century of a very strong relationship, a very special relationship with the U.S. in the region, it was very clear for everybody that we needed to take care of that relationship in a very hands-on way. What we're seeing today, it's a very important change that I think that it's explained by the juncture, of course, but it's also the result of a structural transformation of the international system. And I think that the public opinion is starting to understand that transformation, in a very comprehensive and I would say wise way. What's the caveat that I would like to introduce to this discussion? It seems to me that the private sector, it seems to me that social organizations, civil society are aware that we need to look at some other actors in the international system. But the question that I still have is how much is public opinion conscious about the fact that, approaching China and approaching other actors in the international system, but particularly China, is going to generate a cost in terms of our relationship with the US, right? And this is something that depends not only on the fact or whether we approach or not China politically and economically, but also the way we do it. And I have to say that I totally share the explanation and the approach that Luis Fernando has in terms of our recent decision of being part of the BRI. But my concern is, that I feel sometimes people in Colombia read this decision not as an economic or a commercial decision, but as a political decision, and a political decision coming from, of course, our first leftist government, a government that believes by ideology, among other things, that we need to take some distance from the US. So this is the part that concerns me the most, because I think that this is where you find very different readings in Colombia, political readings in Colombia, about this new form of constructing our foreign policy. But we can discuss about this a little bit later, because I don't want to take too long to answer this question.
No, that's perfect, Sandra, and that's pretty much right where I wanted to head. I think one aspect that's missing in this conversation so far is the U.S. side of things. Andrew mentioned the 24-hour diplomatic crisis between our two countries back in January. So I wanted to ask you, Enrique, what are the clearest signs, at least here in Washington, that Colombia's collaboration with China is straining the bilateral relationship with the U.S.? Can't quite hear you, Enrique. Sorry. You might be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for having me here today. I think that despite that Colombia has been a bipartisan priority for the US for the last 20 years, it is important to recognize that during the last 20 years, Colombia has tried to approach in a very shy way to China, particularly in terms of trade. And when Colombia has done that, that obviously created some noise here in the past. For example, I can remember back in the year 2016, under the administration of President Santos, the Colombian government did a big delegation to China in order to promote Colombian agricultural trade with China. And this was not taken in a very good way by the US government, because they consider that as an important approach, trying to create more business ties with China. In reality, that was a strategy trying to push the US phytosanitary authorities to move forward with the authorization of the market access for Colombian avocados and Colombian mangoes and things like that. But I have to be very clear that the current situation right now with the Colombian accession to the Belt and Road Initiative and the recent accession to the BRICS Bank obviously is a different moment and is creating more strains. But moving forward, I have to say that if China starts investing in Colombia, particularly in certain sectors like infrastructure that is somehow connected with trade corridors for exports or imports from the US, this will create additional noise. But also investing in technology will create alarms in terms of cybersecurity. I will end saying that any type of approach of the Colombian government with the Chinese seeking for cooperation in the military arena will create more strains and more worries here in DC. And finally, any particular approach in the multilateral arena, for example, Colombia avoiding taking a vote at the United Nations that could help China, it will create more tensions in this regard. But to be completely honest, always it has been a channel of diplomatic noise here in DC when a Latin American country tried to create more ties in China, particularly in trade.
Thank you, Enrique. And I think you're right. I think we're likely to see further signs of displeasure here in Washington with Petro's recent decisions, not only on cozying up with China, but also on drugs and security. I mean, we know that a crucial deadline for the U.S. to certify Colombia as a counter-narcotics partner is approaching in September, and there's real questions about whether the U.S. still sees Colombia as a vital partner in its approach to counter-narcotics and drug trafficking in the region. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions to our speakers, you can ask them via askac.org. Just go to the website and drop your question in, and I will read them to our speakers. We have one here, actually. I think for Andrew, I think you'd be best positioned to respond to this. This is from Gerardo Lameda. He's asking, what actions and policies is China implementing in Colombia and the region to increase its commercial and political footprint? And what is the U.S. doing to neutralize it? I think this gets to what you're saying, Andrew, that that the U.S. is at a moment where it sees a critical opportunity to try to position itself as a more constructive partner than China, and it's evaluating its tools. So, what do you see in your reporting? What exactly is China offering, and how is the U.S. looking to respond?
Look, I think the U.S. I think some of the U.S.'s actions within the region are reverberating far. Like we look at what was happening in Panama, whether rhetorical or beyond actual physical threats to Panama to retake the canal and other threats, whether projects around that area. I think it is causing a lot of concern among leaders and policymakers throughout South America. I think oftentimes was these trips, whether it's we had Hexas in Panama, or we had Treasury Secretary Besset and in Argentina earlier this year, talking about their currency swap with DIA and these comments that they need to pull back. I think this does cause a lot of concern, depending how serious they are or not. That said, we're not really seeing an alternative many of these times being here. I think Panama is a particularly sensitive issue, just given the amount of traffic in trade, U.S. Battleships that all go through there. But when you look at places like Argentina, and someone's that's looking to have a closer relationship with the U.S., we have not yet seen we're not yet seeing a policy alternative being presented there. I mean, yes, the Argentina has negotiated new debt deals, but by and large, it's kind of, I don't know, it almost feels like shooting at the hip at times. And when we have these visits coming down to the region, we're seeing a lot of tweets, a lot of this, but we're not seeing a lot of big deals being presented in the region. On the contrary, a lot of China business is continuing to ramp up, whether these are EVs in Brazil, or like I said, I mentioned the currency swap, which rolled over in Argentina, and this business keeps going. What we've seen also in China over years, it's no longer these big, bilateral deals between presidents, but often at the state and municipal levels. Like they're still oftentimes between governors in Brazil or other nations through the region. They're negotiating these deals directly now. So we're not seeing the headlines like we did years back when Venezuela or others were making these huge expensive loans, but we're seeing it, happening more and more at a more micro level. And I think the US is going to have a harder time competing with this at a time while it continues to ratchet back the traditional tools, whether that's USAID or in the State Department. We haven't seen embassies being shuttered like we have in Africa and elsewhere, but it is something that has been, being mulled right now. So I'm struggling to see a lasting policy in the US to compete with this.
Thanks, Andy. Luis Fernando, let's bring it back to Colombia for a second. Just from a Colombia perspective, given the dynamics that Andy's describing, what do you think the U.S. could do to present itself as a more competitive and attractive partner in the face of China's growing presence?
Yeah, of course. So from Colombia's point of view, the United States remains, of course, a strategic ally. But in today's multipolar world, loyalty cannot be based on history alone. So it has to be earned continuously throughout mutual beneficial engagement. So as China is expanding its footprint in Latin America through initiatives like the BRI, the US faces, of course, a strategic choice. Either it competes by offering credible alternatives or risks being perceived as a declining partner. So what does credible alternatives means for Colombia? First, it means shifting from a relationship centered primarily on security and anti-narcotics cooperation to one focused on shared economic development. Infrastructure, clean energy, technology, education are areas where US expertise and capital could make a significant impact. So the United States could think about creating new financing mechanisms or implementing the ones that has announced before that can rival the scale and speed of Chinese investment while adhering to democratic values and rule of law standards. I think that's one key point for the US. Second, I think the US must support Colombia's deeper integration into global value chains. That means facilitating nearshoring opportunities, supporting digital connectivity, and helping our businesses meet international standards in logistics, e-commerce, and intellectual property. These are the real levers of competitiveness in the 21st century. So I think that would go a deep way in terms of helping balancing this US-China relationship with Colombia. Third, of course, trade policy matters. Colombia has an FTA with the United States. Its impact has been uneven. So I think a reinvigorated US approach could include technical assistance for small and medium-sized exporters, more flexible rules of origin, and even support for Colombia's entry into other trade platforms. I think, of course, that's difficult given all the changes with the Trump administration, but I'm thinking more in the medium or long term. And finally, tone matters, of course. The US must approach Colombia as a partner. That means acknowledging that Colombia has a right to diversify its relationship and recognizing that cooperation must be based on mutual respect. So I think strategic patience, economic pragmatism, and diplomatic humility will go much further than, I think, punitive rhetoric, if you call it that way. So in short, I think the best way for the United States to compete with China in Colombia is not to try to block Chinese engagement, but actually to offer something better to what China is offering to the current Colombian government.
Thank you. I think we have a question here actually specifically on that, the issue of what action might the U.S. take in response to Chinese investment in Colombia. Some of our speakers mentioned that tech and military are particularly sensitive issues, but what might the U.S. do in response to this recent decision? Sandra, what do you think? You've been following U.S.-Colombia relations for a good while now. What do you think the U.S. response might be to these recent decisions? And also, how could this play out in Colombia, knowing that we're heading into a very complicated election cycle?
Yeah, I think that, my first impression is that due to the big and strong debate that we had here, when the Colombian government decided to enter the BRI, you would have guessed that the reaction by the US was going to be astronomical, right? That there was going to be a lot of retaliation, strong statements, and actually have to confess that their reaction wasn't at least what the private sector here in Colombia was expecting. I think that it was a very mild reaction. As Andrew said, a couple of tweets here and there of the suspected, the usual suspects, but nothing beyond that. And we don't know the impact on the sort of more private bilateral understanding so far. That basically means something that we already knew, which is basically that the US has a very limited space for this reaction, right? I think that they still have instruments, and we're approaching the certification decision in terms of our performance, in terms of the war on drugs, and this is going to be a contentious issue here. But I think that also they are understanding a very crucial political component of this whole discussion, which is basically that the more they antagonize, especially leftist governments in the region, the more these governments and these presidents grow in terms of public opinion. It happened in Canada, it happened in Mexico, and if the approach is the same, it's going to happen in Colombia too. So I think that they have to walk a very thin line between demanding things, demanding performance, good performance in terms of the war on drugs, demanding that this diversification process is a responsible diversification process. But on the other hand, they also have to have a political sort of rationale in mind, which is basically that they cannot be the ones who push, a next government also from a leftist force. I think that talking about the next elections, we're going to have elections here in Colombia next year. And part of what the government is expecting to is that to the extent that they can, present themselves as the victims, and also as the main force resisting a sort of imposition from the United States, that's going to be good for them in electoral terms. So this is a very thin line that I think that has to be walked, and I think that the U.S. is starting, at least this government is starting to understand that it cannot push too far, but it also has to get things done.
Thank you. Enrique, I want to get your perspective on this as well. I mean, how do you think that this is going to play out from now till the upcoming elections in Colombia? And how do you see the U.S.-Colombia relationship shifting, given that this is an issue that will have some kind of an impact at least?
Thank you, Jeff. I think that in the side of the U.S., the U.S. needs to think the Latin American countries' approach, including Colombia, to China in a different way. And this could create positive repercussions in terms of the election cycle. For example, the US needs to move forward in a more strategic driving position rather than a defensive strategy. And for instance, in the case of trade and investment, the US certainly can use a couple of tools available to strengthen the relation with Colombia. The first one, in terms of investment, as you know, currently the US Congress is discussing the reauthorization of the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, which is the tool for creating development finance strategy in the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, to increase US investment. However, Colombia has not been a target for the DFC and many other Latin American countries, and is due to the fact that in the case of Colombia, since Colombia is an OECD country, our indicators are not considered as a target country for investment or lending under DFC rules. We are considered a middle income country, and this is the same case for Panama as for Chile and many other countries. So if the US Congress considers to be more flexible in terms of the requirements for providing lending and equity to infrastructure projects in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, and to evaluate projects rather than to evaluating countries, this will be an immense tool for creating a big difference on investing in Colombia. And secondly, I think, and Luis Fernando mentioned this, the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. The U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement has an institutional framework that has not been used either by the Petro administration or by the Trump administration, and is the Free Trade Commission and the technical committees where they can sit together and discuss how to solve many issues on both sides of the relation. The U.S., for example, has raised flags on restrictions to trade that Colombia is currently having right now, but Colombia has same concerns on many other things related to granting market access for agricultural products. But those institutional committees and the institutional framework are the place for discussing those discrepancies and try to find a solution. The solution is not imposing tariffs to a partner, and specifically to a country that provides a great surplus for the U.S. in terms of trade.
Thanks, Enrique. Yeah, one of the few countries that still has a trade surplus with the U.S. And an important reminder that we don't necessarily have to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the U.S.-Colombia FTA. Andy, there's a question here for you specifically. This is from Michael Shifter. He says, you said that China is winning hearts and minds in Colombia and Latin America. Might it be more accurate to say that the U.S. is currently at risk of losing hearts and minds, and China is taking an advantage? How do you see that? And then also on your regional chart of different attitudes across the region, Michael's asking, would it be correct to say that Mexico and Colombia are the two main countries that reflect recent increased interest in China, whereas Peru and Brazil are maybe more stable since China's had longstanding relationships with those two countries? How do you see the difference in the region? And again, is the U.S. losing hearts and minds, and is China taking advantage, or is it that China's actively winning hearts and minds?
I think they're good questions. Look, I think piggybacking on in Enrique's points here, when we look in the polling, one of the things in Colombia, for instance, that Colombians are really worried about, well beyond this spat between Petro and Donald Trump, is you're seeing, not including my president, really big fears about the fallout from tariffs across the board. Respondents showed big concerns about tariffs. They also said Colombia has a right to respond to these tariffs. So yes, to Mike's question, I do think that China, in some ways, this is creating an opening for China, especially when you talk about things like free trade agreements that are not being used, and on the contrary, you're piling fresh taxes on top of this. I think this is creating a lot of needs among many Latin Americans. Yes, in many of these countries, Brazil and Peru, there's already China is the top trade partner, and I don't see that, especially in the current setup, being reversed at any juncture. On the contrary, we're seeing mega projects being completed, like whether they in the port in Peru, Lula making repeated visits, the ink deals, and yes, I think Michael has a point here. Clearly, I think these shifting, especially in Mexico and Colombia, evidence this. I think these constant tensions with Mexico's president the constant tensions with this is going to reverberate through the population. I mean, there are constant news, these are constant news cycles, and we're not seeing China present this type of drama with its trade partners. And as I mentioned before, we're often seeing across the region, business and diplomacy being performed on a municipal and state level, state level. It's very hard for US to compete with this, but in this context where you're pulling back aid and China is increasing with very little conditions. It's hard to make, I think, it's hard for the US to make a counter argument. Yes, we can. I think there's often a lot of talk about the risk of things like Chinese 5G technology, and we saw this being directed at countries like Costa Rica as well. But to your point earlier, Jeff, I think without providing alternatives, China is going to continue to take advantage of this.
Thanks. We have one question here from Lewis, which is, which Colombian sectors are specific targets for Chinese investment? And do you have any project examples in mind? Luis Fernando, you mentioned a couple sectors, but I'm wondering, there's still a lot of crystal ball gazing going on right now. We're still sort of wondering exactly what Colombia's intent to join the BRI actually means for Colombia. But if you had to bet, what specific sectors are most attractive for Chinese investment, and what kind of projects could we expect from this?
Yes, Jeff. I think infrastructure is of course the obvious answer. So China has been very willing to finance big infrastructure projects in Colombia, particularly the Metro de Bogotá, which is the largest infrastructure investment in Colombia for the next 4 years or so. So that's one. They also have some investments in the energy sector as well. I think those two, infrastructure and energy, are the key targets. And the discussions that the Colombian government has had with China, of course, there's very interesting talks opening on the technological front, which I think is another issue that will come up in terms of the bilateral relationship between Colombia and the U.S. Given the stronger presence of China, Huawei, and other Chinese state companies on Colombia, how the rules of the game can be set so that this type of new infrastructure projects are given allow for the necessary competitiveness instead of being just government-to-government agreements that could put some other countries away from the competition. So I think those two sectors, infrastructure, energy, and again, technological, are the key sectors that will be discussed in the coming years.
Thanks, Luis Fernando. Well, we're almost out of time, but I would love to get just a very quick round robin from each of you on exactly where you think this is headed, and what the specific implications are for U.S. policy in the region. If you can just give me some closing thoughts in 1 minute or less. What's the key issue that we should be watching in Colombia's decision to join the BRI, and what does it mean for the U.S.-Colombia relationship? Andy, over to you. 1 minute. What's the key issue that we need to follow to better understand this moving forward?
I think more broadly, one thing that jumped out at me looking at these poll numbers is just how quickly the US's image is sliding, and I think in a context of election next year, I think it'll be really interesting to see how productive candidates manage this relationship with Donald Trump, whether that is taking a hard stand against him, or seeing somewhere else in Ecuador, El Salvador, Argentina trying to win his favor with that. And as we start to see more new deals being inked, I'm very curious to see what the U.S. reaction is going to be. As we've highlighted in this conversation, it's been minimal so far. We've seen some tweets. After the blow up with Panama, I've all kind of waiting, like, what's the next piece of key infrastructure the U.S. is going to really harp on, and we haven't seen that yet. So I don't know if that comes with another blow up between Petro or elsewhere, but we haven't seen in the last few months the U.S. really come down on another ally or lukewarm key ally in the region. So yeah, that's what I'm watching for.
Sandra, what are you going to be watching as this unfolds over the next few months?
No, I guess that it's a very interesting thing what Andrew is saying, because I think that the approach to China, even though it's stronger during a leftist government, we have to say that it didn't start with the Petro administration, right? I mean, the Santos administration negotiated a free trade agreement with China, and we had a whole discussion about this. It wasn't approved, but we had a whole discussion about this. So my sense is that whatever government we have next, I think that the Petro administration already paid the cost of approaching China in spite of the U.S., and I see no reason for the next government to take that back. Right. I mean, this has been something that it was, discussed. We had a whole political debate here in Colombia. We run the risk of deteriorating our relationship with the U.S. That whole thing is done. So I think that the ship of the diversification of our foreign policy has sailed. And I think that the next governments are going to try to move in a more pragmatic way. I don't think that they are going to use the approach to China to antagonize the U.S., but I also don't see any government, since this has no ideological component. I see no other government starting by saying, well, you know what, we have to take this back because it was a mistake. Yesterday, the government announced that we're now part of the new development bank in the BRICS. And I think that a very important part of the country has received those news as good news. And now that I see Andrew's data, I understand why. So I think that we're moving forward in that direction with less political antagonizing, but still keeping that direction.
Thanks. Yeah. So there may be no way to put the genie back in the bottle. Enrique, what are you going to be following as this unfolds?
Thank you, Jeff. I think in terms of trade, what we're going to see after the accession of Colombia to the Belt and Road Initiative is that we're going to buy more things from China. And this has been a trend during the last 10 or 15 years. And for doing that, there's always a menace for the US. Why? Because Colombia is going to buy more technological devices, more capital goods that can be also bought in the US despite of a free trade agreement. But I have to say that in terms of a scale and sometimes in terms of cost, it will be cheaper buying those things from China. However, there is a big concern on doing business with China. There are certain raw materials and certain inputs that the Colombian manufacturing sector needs for exporting to the U.S. final goods. In particular, I am referring to steel and aluminum products. And Colombia is still under the list of countries being penalized with tariffs under Section 232 for steel and aluminum because of the risk of Colombia triangulating imports from China to Colombia and then to the US. So now Colombia has a big pressure to melt all the steel or all the aluminum coming from China and other southeastern countries in order to claim the rule of origin benefits from the US free trade agreement. I see that that's going to trend that is going to continue, but there are other sectors in the U.S.-Colombia relation that might not be affected. For example, Colombia is the main buyer of U.S. yellow corn in South America and the third in the world. Probably that's not going to change in the short run because China is not capable at this time to cover that market. But I think that the trend will continue and this will create noises here in DC.
Perhaps inevitably so. Luis Fernando, last but not least, what is your top takeaway from this, and what are you going to be watching as this China-Colombia relationship moves forward?
Well, Sandra mentioned this, but I think it's going to be key in the short term is the certification process. I think that Colombia's joining the BRI will probably give just additional justification for the U.S. to decertify the country. The numbers are abysmal. Coca cultivation increased by 10% from 2022 to 2023. So that just probably is just a done deal. It will add an additional argument for the U.S. to decertify the country. But on the other hand, and I think Sandra also mentioned this, I think that Washington will likely refrain from imposing any additional punitive measures on Colombia, because that could push Colombia further into China's sphere of influence, of course, contradicting U.S. strategic interests. So I think that what we're going to see is a wait and see approach. We have 14 months of the new election. There's going to be a new administration, and I think Washington will wait and see what's the tone of the new incoming administration, and I think that gives you the sense that damage to the U.S.-Colombia relations in the short term will be probably limited. And I agree again with Sandra that probably there will not coming back. I think the new country will not renege on the BRI, will continue diversifying the trade agreements, the economic policy, trade policy. And I think if we move from a reactive strategic policy to a more forward-looking policy, that would probably be good for Colombia in the medium and long term.
Well, thank you so much, Luis Fernando. I want to invite everyone to follow your incredible work at Fede Desarrollo. We're so happy to be able to partner with you all on this event and with the CEPAS network. And of course, thank you to Andy Rosati from Bloomberg, Sandra Borda, Enrique. Thank you all for sharing your expertise. This is very much a developing story, and so look forward to continuing the conversation. As we've heard, Colombia's decision to join the BRI marks a significant moment, one that presents some critical challenges, but also some potential opportunities. Navigating these dynamics is going to require careful strategy from policymakers in Washington as we think about a thoughtful response. That said, I want to encourage everyone also to stay tuned for a forthcoming issue brief from us at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, looking at the U.S.-Colombia economic relationship and specifically how it can be made more competitive in light of China's increasing footprint in Colombia and in the region. So stay tuned for more from us on that. And thank you again for joining us this morning for this conversation. And thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quiero que aunque norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al cabo son